May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor. A carrier limps toward the channel, trailing oil for 10 miles behind her. Her flight deck is scorched. Her hull is torn open below the waterline. Smoke damage darkens her island structure. This is USS Yorktown, and by every normal measure of naval warfare, she is finished. 3 weeks earlier, in the Coral Sea, a Japanese dive bomber put a 550-pound bomb through her flight deck. It punched down 4 decks before detonating, killing dozens of men instantly. Near misses had buckled her hull plates and ruptured fuel bunkers. Japanese pilots who attacked her that day reported her sunk, or as good as sunk. Japanese naval intelligence believed the same thing. Somewhere in Tokyo, planners were already building their next operation on the assumption that this carrier no longer existed. They were about to be wrong in a way that would help decide the Pacific War. Because in the time it takes most navies to finish a damage assessment, American repair crews at Pearl Harbor were about to put Yorktown back into a fight nobody expected her to reach. What looked like a dying ship pulling into harbor was actually a ship about to become the center of the most consequential ambush in American naval history. But first, the Japanese had every reason to believe they had already won. Japan's confidence was not arrogance without foundation. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had reasons, real ones, to believe it held every advantage in the Pacific. Its carrier pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of years of combat over China and the opening strikes of the Pacific War. Its Zero fighters outperformed nearly anything the Americans could put in the air. Its doctrine of concentrated carrier strike power, refined and rehearsed since Pearl Harbor, had worked in every major engagement so far. Japanese naval planners built their next operation, an assault on Midway Atoll, on a straightforward calculation. American carrier strength in the Pacific had just been cut in half. USS Lexington had gone down at Coral Sea. Yorktown, by every visual account from the pilots who bombed her, was too damaged to matter. That left, in Japanese estimates, only 2 operational American fleet carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, against a Japanese strike force built around 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crewed by the men who had opened the war at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan for Midway depended on that numerical gap. Lure the remaining American carriers into a trap near the atoll, destroy them, and open the Central Pacific to Japanese control. It was an aggressive plan, but not a reckless one. It was built on the best information Japanese intelligence had, and that information said Yorktown was out of the equation. That single assumption that a wounded American carrier could not possibly return to the fight in time was about to become the crack in an otherwise disciplined plan. Because Yorktown was not just limping home, she was heading toward the one shipyard on Earth that was about to treat a normal repair timeline as a suggestion rather than a rule. What made the difference was not a secret weapon, it was a system and the man running it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, already had something the Japanese did not know he had. A working picture of Japanese intentions built from codebreakers who had been reading pieces of the Imperial Navy's operational traffic. Nimitz knew Midway was the target. He knew roughly when the attack was coming, and he knew that if Yorktown could not be made ready in time, the United States would be sending 2 carriers against 4 in a battle that could decide the war in the Pacific. So when Yorktown eased into dry dock number 1 on the morning of May 28th and the water began draining away to expose the full extent of the damage, Nimitz did not wait for a formal repair estimate to come up through channels. He climbed down into the dry dock himself in waders to look at the hull with his own eyes. Naval engineers who inspected the damage estimated repairs would take weeks, some accounts say as long as 90 days at a proper shipyard on the mainland. Nimitz gave them a fraction of that. According to accounts from officers present, he told the repair teams the ship needed to be ready in a matter of days, not weeks. This is the part the Japanese calculation could never have accounted for. It was not simply that American shipyards were fast. It was that Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard had, since December 7th, become a wartime organism built for exactly this kind of emergency, capable of pulling workers, materials, and improvisation together on a compressed timeline that peacetime engineering standards would have called impossible. The gap between what the enemy believed was possible and what the Americans had quietly built the capacity to do, that gap was the hidden edge, and it was about to close faster than anyone expected. The plan itself was a gamble stacked on a gamble. Some of Yorktown's damage was structural and severe. Her superheater boilers, damaged in the Coral Sea action, could not be fully repaired in the time available, which meant her top speed would be reduced for the coming battle. Her hull carried torn plating below the waterline that needed patching well enough to survive open ocean, not just harbor conditions. Compartments flooded during the Coral Sea fight needed pumping and shoring. And underneath all of it, the normal safety procedure of purging aviation fuel tanks before entering dry dock, a full day's work by itself, was something Nimitz ordered skipped entirely to save time. Around 1,700 workers, some accounts put the number near 1,400, descended on the ship in shifts that never stopped. Welders worked through the night under floodlights. Foremen abandoned formal blueprints in favor of direct consultation with the ship's original construction drawings, making calls on the fly about what absolutely had to be fixed and what could be left for later, once the ship was back in the Pacific instead of in dry dock. There was no illusion that this would be a full repair. The goal was narrower and more dangerous: get Yorktown seaworthy enough and combat-capable enough to sail into one of the most important battles of the war, with wounds still unhealed underneath the patchwork. Meanwhile, air groups had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. Yorktown's own squadrons had taken losses at Coral Sea, so pilots and air crews were pulled in from other units, including men from USS Saratoga, to fill out her flight decks in time. Many of these pilots had never flown together before. They would be going into one of the largest carrier battles in history as a stitched-together team, on a ship still being welded shut around them. Every hour of this compressed timeline carried the risk of failure. A patch that didn't hold at sea, a boiler system that gave out under combat speed, an air group that couldn't coordinate under pressure. The Americans were not executing a safe plan. They were executing the only plan that gave them a chance to close the carrier gap before the Japanese fleet reached Midway, and they were running out of hours to find out if it would work. On May 29th, welding torches were still running on Yorktown's hull as flooding orders began filling the dry dock again. On the morning of May 30th, roughly 72 hours after she had entered dry dock, with engineers predicting weeks of work, Yorktown put to sea. She was not fully repaired, she was fully committed. Task Force 17, built around the patched carrier, sailed to join Task Force 16 and its two carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, positioning northeast of Midway Atoll. On the other side of the board, Yamamoto's four-carrier strike force steamed toward the same waters, still operating on the belief that only two American flat-tops could possibly be waiting for them. On June 4th, the battle began. Japanese aircraft struck first at Midway's ground installations. American carrier aircraft, launched in a chaotic, imperfectly coordinated strike from three separate carriers, found and hit the Japanese carrier force in a matter of minutes that reshaped the entire Pacific War. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown caught Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with their flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, mid-rearming, at the single most vulnerable moment a carrier can experience. Three Japanese fleet carriers were left burning within roughly 6 minutes of the American strike arriving overhead. Yorktown's own air group played a direct role in that devastation, contributing to the destruction of Soryu. The ship the Japanese believed no longer existed had just helped cripple half of the strike force built to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. But the battle and Yorktown's ordeal were far from finished. Hiryu, the one Japanese carrier still operational, launched counterstrikes that afternoon, and her pilots found Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers scored hits that tore through her flight deck and knocked out power, leaving her dead in the water with fires burning. For a stretch of minutes, the ship that had just helped cripple 3 enemy carriers looked like she might join them before the day was even over. Then the same discipline that had rebuilt her hull in a dry dock went to work rebuilding her power plant in open water. Damage control teams fought through smoke and flooded compartments to bring her back, and against difficult odds, they succeeded. Within roughly an hour, Yorktown's engineers had restored enough power for her to make 90 knots and resume flight operations, an extraordinary recovery in the middle of an active battle. Radar crews kept watching the horizon, waiting to find out if that recovery had bought enough time. It hadn't. A second wave of Japanese aircraft, launched from the same wounded Hiryu, found her again that same afternoon, and this time torpedo hits struck home below the waterline, tearing open compartments that had only just been patched weeks earlier and leaving the ship listing badly to port. Power failed again, and with it the pumps that might have controlled the flooding. With the ship in real danger of capsizing and taking her crew down with her, the order came to abandon ship. Even that was not the end of the story. American forces later located Hiryu's position from returning strike aircraft and launched a counterattack that afternoon, leaving the 4th and final Japanese fleet carrier burning as well. By the close of June 4th, all 4 of the carriers Japan had committed to the Midway operation were destroyed or fatally damaged. Yorktown herself did not survive to see the full victory. A salvage crew returned to the ship in the following days, working to save her and get her under tow. But the Japanese submarine I-168 found her on June 6th and put 2 torpedoes into her hull, along with a fatal hit on the destroyer USS Hammond alongside. Yorktown finally sank on the morning of June 7, 1942. She had been given 72 hours to live again. She used those hours to help sink 3 enemy fleet carriers and contribute directly to the destruction of a 4th. The numbers from Midway are some of the most consequential in naval history. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Roughly 250 Japanese aircraft lost, along with a corps of experienced pilots and maintenance crews that Japan could not easily replace. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and 1 destroyer, Hammond, along with roughly 150 aircraft. Before Coral Sea and Midway, Japan had gone nearly 6 months without a major strategic defeat. After Midway, Japan would never again hold the initiative in the Pacific War. The carrier force that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor was gutted in a single afternoon, in a battle that Japanese planners had built around a carrier they believed no longer existed. Yorktown's 72 hours in dry dock were not a footnote to that outcome. They were a precondition for it. Without her 3rd flight deck in the water on June 4th, the carrier math at Midway tips further in Japan's favor, and the outcome of the battle becomes far less certain. The deeper significance of Yorktown's repair goes beyond 1 ship or 1 battle. It reveals something about how the United States fought the war that Japan's doctrine never fully accounted for: an industrial and organizational capacity that could compress what should have been months of work into days, without a blueprint for how to do it beforehand, simply because the situation demanded it. Japan's naval planning was built on excellent tactics executed by extraordinary pilots. American naval planning, especially at Pearl Harbor in the spring of 1942, was increasingly built on something else: the ability to absorb a blow, assess it honestly, and rebuild combat power faster than the enemy believed was mathematically possible. Yorktown's repair crews did not win Midway by themselves, but they made sure the men who did win it would have a 3rd deck to fly from. That is the pattern that would repeat across the Pacific for the next 3 years. American industrial improvisation closing gaps that Japanese doctrine assumed were permanent. Midway was the first time that pattern decided a battle at this scale, and it began in a dry dock, with welders working through the night on a ship the enemy had already written off. Yorktown went down on June 7, 1942, 5 weeks after Coral Sea should have ended her war. In the time she had left, she helped break the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. The Japanese pilots who watched her burn at Coral Sea had reported her destroyed. In a sense, they were only wrong about the timing. What they never understood was that being counted out was never the same thing for this ship or this navy as being finished.